Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today in War Thunder it is time to talk about some speculation, because well, first of all it's always fun, and second of all it's a great stepping stone to talk about a bunch of ideas which you would like to see in the game, or maybe think is going to come to the game later on. This doesn't mean that I believe in this leak at all. If anything, I would actually side on the fact that it looks completely balmy. And then as well, on top of this, the source for the leaks in the past has definitely been a little bit all over the place when it comes to leaks. Sometimes it's got it right, sometimes it's got it very wrong, and other times it seems like partial stuff, which is what I think we have here. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, so we're talking about the War Thunder blog, which finds itself on VK. Now, if you don't know what VK is, it is a kind of Russian Facebook in a way, and if you want to know any news about War Thunder, normally it's the best place to actually go to the official War Thunder platforms on VK, because they actually give you a lot of information about what's going on. Now, the blog that we're going to be looking at is not an official Gaijin blog. It's just one place where a lot of news and a lot of ideas gets posted by what seems to be a person or a company which is unaffiliated with Gaijin. In the past, they've even brought up my videos in the game, such as the Orbital video, and also a video looking at the BT7, which is coming. So they just seem to be a place which is kind of a news aggregator for War Thunder, which is, you know, you kind of need them in the community, but it doesn't mean we should see them as an official source. So what they did a few days ago, on the 24th of August, is they put out this list of things that they believe is planned for update 1.91. Now, of course, it was in Russian, so therefore we had to translate it. And from the translation, you can see that it says new mechanics, 7th rank for helicopters. The USA is getting a fighter and a light cruiser, the USSR a fighter, floating tank and a light cruiser, Britain getting 2 fighters, Japan an SPG and a heavy cruiser, Germany getting a heavy cruiser and a helicopter, Italy getting medium tank, a AA in the form, you know, because it says ZSU, 2 fighters, 2 interceptors, and France getting a medium tank and a helicopter. So everybody's getting a little bit of everything according to this list. But the first thing to point out is this list does not have British helicopters in it, which we know is a main part of the update. It also doesn't talk about the German replacements which are coming in the form of the Ostwind and also the M48. So it seems a little bit odd, in my opinion, that, you know, we have this list and it doesn't talk about them. And also, if you have a look at previous updates, so update 1.89, which was of course the Imperial Navy update, where Japan was added to the game, there was 45 vehicles which was added to the game in that patch. So shows that there was a lot of vehicles in the last update, generally top tier stuff, and also of course the Japanese Navy. The patch before, update 1.87, we had the French helicopters added, and that gave us 31 vehicles, so a little bit less, but a few more mechanics in that. And then even update 1.81, so going back a year, you had 28 vehicles in the update, which is when helicopters were added to the game. We got the Soviet and the American tech tree. Now this leak only has 19 vehicles, showing that it would be an incredibly low amount of vehicles for an update, if this was to be true. And as we already said, it doesn't seem to have in it some of the devlogs that have already been passed. So even if this is a true leak, what we're seeing here is a leak which does not cover at least the full breadth of the update, and it covers it in very general terms. So instead of taking this as gospel, instead of taking this as truth, I'm personally going to use it as a platform so we can talk about some interesting vehicles that we may see in the game, which I think is always a good thing to do with this type of stuff. So the first one, of course, is a US fighter. Now what could we see as a US fighter? Well, we know that there was some leaks a few months ago from a specific designer or modeler, and it was of the Crusader F-8. We got one for the French and one for the Americans, and in my opinion it's probably best to give it to the Americans first, just because of the fact that, well, it was an American vehicle. So having the Crusader F-8 come into game, I think, would be a positive thing, and it would be another escalation of air forces when it comes to the speed and agility of these aircraft. But if we have a look at some of the other nations, they're going to have to go that extra stage anyway to be able to stay competitive. So the F-8 Crusader is probably known best for its role in the Vietnam War. It also was a supersonic carrier-based air superiority jet aircraft. The main design feature that it had was, of course, the variable incidence wing, which was incredibly good for it. And also on top of this, it fought incredibly well against MiG-17s and MiG-21s, swatting them out of the air as it felt like. Being a Vietnam-era jet, especially carrier-based, it had access to many different armaments, including the guns. So one of the things that it is known for, let's say, is the fact that it is seen as one of the last gun jets. Now, this doesn't mean that jets after it didn't have guns. It just means that this machine, its focus was on guns before other ordnance. And the reason for this is because even at this time, even at the Vietnam War era, the missiles that were on board did not have a good enough success rate to be able to be used as actual, primary weapon. So even then, the Crusader was seen as gun first. It had 4 20mm Colt Mark 12s with 125 rounds per gun, so definitely enough to be able to shred anything that we have in the air. It also had 2 side fuselage mounted Y pylons and 2 underwing pylon stations. And also, it could carry, on top of this, 2 LAU-10 rocket pods, each with 4 5-inch 127mm Zunis. Then, it could either carry AIM-9 Sidewinders, Matra Magics, which would be for, of course, the French version, and bullpups. It also could carry a ton of variations of bombs as well. But the main thing about the F-8 Crusader is the reason why it came around is because there was a need for a carrier-based aircraft which could go faster than Mach 1.2. And that's basically where it came from. And the F-8E version, which I believe is not the version we're going to get, could go Mach 1.86. But most of the versions that were built before the E, which was seen as an incredibly good version of it, you could definitely go, above 1.2, so between the 1.2 1.4 area, which I think would be a hell of a lot better for it and better for game balance than just putting in one which could go 1.8. But then again, there isn't a lot of other options for other nations, so maybe we're going to get that pretty quick one. The next one is, of course, the light cruiser, the USS Atlanta. Now, we know this is coming because there was a dev blog for it, so there's not really a lot to say about this one. It's obviously going to be a very strong light cruiser in the game, has a ton of guns on it. The only issue it's going to have is its AA defense, but as long as you're paying attention, you should be able to be fine with turning those 127mm on planes coming in. The next stuff is, of course, for the Soviets, and we have access to a fighter, a floating tank, and a light cruiser. So the fighter, I've gone a bit out on a limb here, but the reason is because I'm going to be looking at some different variants that people might not be used to. So the fighter I picked personally is the Mig-21. This is going to be the next big iteration of the Soviet tech tree in the form of their fighters, since we already have the Mig-19 PT in the game already. The Mig-21 is, of course, a interceptor aircraft. It is incredibly fast for what it is, and it has many different versions around it. And at the same time, the comparison can be made between it, the F-104 Starfighter, the F-5 Freedom Fighter, and of course the Dassault Mirage 3 with its design and what it was capable of. The other things about it as well, they needed some form of Mach 2 aircraft, and this was seen as a machine which would eventually get them over that Mach 2 barrier. And a lot of people will be surprised that I'm advocating for a Mach 2 machine, but if you look at other machines, if you look at other nations, the biggest problem that we have is a lot of nations have a jump between Mach 1 and Mach 2. They don't have many mid-Mach vehicles. So a nation like Britain went from sub-Mach to Mach 2. And unless you look at some prototypes which never had guns and were never going to be fully produced, that's all you're going to have when it comes to Britain if you don't want to look at foreign imports. And I don't want to see a game where everybody has an F-104 and everybody just uses F-104s. So yeah, I would rather go a little bit further in history to be able to pick out machines which would be a little bit more comparable, which would be at least having different playstyles. So with the MiG-21, even though the ones that you will know of, it will be stuff like the MiG-21 BIS, which is the very late version of it. I mean, we're talking about 1985. What I would much more prefer to focus on is stuff like the F variant, which came out in 1959. The F variant itself is not as crazy as you may think it is. It was just a single-seat fighter. It was the first production aircraft of the MiG-21. There was 93 of them made, and what it had access to was one NR-30, two NR-23s, and then the later versions had two 30 NR-30s with 60 shells each. So we're not talking about machines which have crazy amounts of ammunition on board, but they did have access to air-to-air missiles. You also had other versions such as the F-13, which of course is the one which a lot of people will know of because it was the one which was used by many different nations, and probably the first one which really came onto the radar. Then you have the actual interceptors, the Generation 2, so the PF version of the MiG-21, which was the production version for the all-weather interceptor. So these were powered by the R11 F2300 turbojets, and these started the 7th production batch of the machine, and they were given more weapons control systems, beam riding AAMs, in addition to the IRC King K-13s. So the interceptor versions that we can get are very nasty, but if they decided, they could easily just give it not that, and instead just give us one of the earlier versions if they wanted to make sure this thing was a little bit more balanced compared to its contemporaries. The air-to-air missiles that machines like the MiG-21 could carry are very vast, but the thing is, just like a lot of other vehicles that we have in game, there were limits to these vehicles, and depending on which variant you want to pick, you could easily limit it to a specific playstyle, and I think that's what you would have to do with the MiG-21. Now, the next one, the floating tank, or the amphibious vehicle as we will know it, is of course the Object 685. This has been in the news on the 22nd of August. It is a 906 with a 100mm on it. We actually found a few pictures for the 685, and it has what seems to be a carousel turret, or sorry, a carousel loader, because it is auto-loaded, and if you have a look at its brothers, which it was made alongside, it has a carousel which is very similar to some of the other machines that we see for the Soviets, but it doesn't go around the whole turret. Instead, it goes around maybe a third of it, and it's very interesting actually to see how it works, and it means that it should be a lower fire rate than the 906, so it should have the same maneuverability as the 906. It should have a slightly better gun with better ammunition, but it'll have a slower reload, which is why the 906 is so powerful. So in my opinion, since this thing's going to be higher BR, it's probably going to be worse than the 906, just because of the fact that it has that reload. The next thing, the Soviet light cruiser. So this is where it gets interesting, because we're slowly but surely running out of light cruisers and heavy cruisers which the Soviets can use. And once we get up to battleships, well, we're going to have even more issues. But the thing is, with the Soviets, they do kind of still have two options for what would be seen as light cruisers. Remember, already two of the light cruisers that the Soviets have in the game will be classed as heavy cruisers under the London Agreement. So therefore, if we have a look at the Project 68s, which were projects designed after World War II, then these would actually fit within the term of a light cruiser once again. So we've actually covered these in another video, in a Pass to the Developers video, because these were some of the last, I suppose, light cruisers or old-style light cruisers that the Soviets made. There was 2 of them at least made, and 4 overall, I believe. And what we have with the Project 68s is much more of a focus on weaponry when it comes to tertiary and secondary parts of it. So with the Project 68A, which was, you know, they were both basically the same design but with slightly different capabilities. So with the Project 68A, what you have is you have 4 sets of triple mounted 152mm, so a lot of firepower from the main guns. From the secondaries, you have 6 sets of dual mounted 100mm dual purpose guns, which will be incredibly fun because their fire rate is pretty nice on top of everything. Then what you have is you have 16 sets of dual 37mm, just to make sure that nothing is coming near your ship at all in the form of aircraft. Then on top of that, you have 8 sets of dual mounted 30mm close range AA guns, so just in case anything gets past the 37s and gets past the long range 100s, you have a failsafe in the form of the 30s. Then on top of this, you have of course the torpedoes. You have 2 sets of 5 of them, which sit on either side. So this is a beefy set of cruisers. You know, they have a lot of secondary guns, and they are just designed to do a ton of damage. Now, with the advent of stuff like the Atlanta, and also the Brooklyn and the Tiger, this machine might be outgunned with its main guns, but with its secondaries, I don't think it will be. With the secondaries, if they're able to get shots off at enemy ships or planes, it should do incredibly well at what it does. And also, as I said, with the Soviets, you have very limited options on what you could add. The other thing that you could add, if you wanted to be really ballsy, is of course a Hipper class. Because if you didn't know, there are 5 ships in the Admiral Hipper class, right? Normally people only talk about 2 of them, or 3 of them. They talk about the Admiral Hipper, and then they talk about the Prince Eugen. Well, there was a few other ones, and one of the other ones was the Blucher, which I'm sure I'm saying completely wrong. You got the Seyditz, and then you got the Luzlo. Now the Luzlo is the interesting one, because this was not fully built. It was launched, but it wasn't completed. The Luzlo in 1939 was launched and laid down in 37, but it was actually given/sold to the Soviets in 1940. Now, it was given to the Soviets in not a full state. Actually only had, I believe, 2 sets of its main guns sorted, and only a 37 as a secondary. And also, while the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the newly named Petropavlovsk, let's try that again, Petropavlovsk, I believe is how you say it. It was still incomplete, and it was used as a floating battery in the defense of Leningrad, and after being hit 53 times, the ship was forced to beach herself and avoid sinking. So the Germans gave the ship to the Soviets in 1940. The Soviets were in the process of finishing the build on it because it wasn't ready to go, since the Germans gave them it in a not great condition. And then in 1940, 1941, the Germans attacked it and nearly sunk the damn thing. And then in 1942, with 62 Ju-87s, 33 Ju-88s, and 37 He-111s, they struck the ships in the harbor of Leningrad, and the Petropavlovsk was hit once, and it suffered serious damage, meaning that it was sunk. And then eventually it was raised and then sold for scrap. So if they don't want to go down the route of Project 68 BIS and the Project 68A, they could easily go down the route of the Admiral Hipper class because of the fact that if this list is correct, we're going to be getting some heavy cruisers from other nations, which would kind of dick on the Project 68. So the next one is Britain, and we're going to have a look at a fighter, and the only fighter which really makes sense top tier right now, since the British, they actually have a pretty competent fighter. You know, the Hunter F-6 seems to be doing very well, as long as you have the SRAM modification, which obviously not everybody has, but the main thing is it seems to be doing alright. What you need to know is, as we talked about before, Britain went from just below Mach 1 to Mach 2, and they skipped the whole Mach 1 era, just because either they wanted to just push through on development of newer vehicles, or they felt like a lot of the vehicles that they created were standard for that time. There's a ton of vehicles which are just sub-Mach 1 that the British made, and also cost is always going to be something that is thrown in there, especially when it comes to Britain. So stuff like the Swift, stuff like the Scimitar, these are vehicles which I'm sure could have been Mach 1 capable if more money was pumped in, but there was no need to. There wasn't a necessary reason for it. So the English Electric Lightning is the fighter I'm going to put forward for the British, for the fighter, or one of the fighters I should say, which will be added to the game. And the reason for this is because to have a go at stuff like the Crusader, the Mig-21 and others which I have in this list, this is the only real competitor that the British have against these machines. And remember, once again, when it comes to it, just like the Mig-21, the Lightning had a bunch of different variants to it. So therefore they could just pick a variant which they think would be more balanced in the game compared to, you know, other variants such as the F-3. Because the Lightning F1, which is what you're seeing in this video in front of you, it's actually a user mission you can get on War Thunder Live. It was the first development batch of aircraft. It had access to two twin 30mm Aiden cannons. It could carry 2 fire streaks, VF radio, and also the Ferranti air pass radar. But the one that a lot of people want is the F3 version of the Lightning, and the reason is because it has the it has an improved radar, and then it has the Avon 301R engines, and of course the red top missiles, which let's just say are quite a large. They're quite a large increase in over the fire streaks. So at least for general use, people would like to see the F3, and then of course the F6, which I would see as kind of the definitive version. Just like you have the Hunter F6, the Lightning F6 was the one which had better efficiency in subsonic performance, because one of the issues with the Lightning is at lower speeds it didn't really handle too well, but you know, they improved that. It had overwing fuel tanks and a large ventral fuel tank. They added back in the 30mm cannon because, well, they needed it. Obviously the red top missiles as well, and therefore it just had kind of everything you needed. So when it comes to the max speed of this behemoth, you're looking at around Mach 2. I've read mainly 2.2 seems to be the one that you know, everybody quotes, but as I've said, the F1, which did not have these Avon 301Rs, would go slower than this, so if you needed to balance it, that would be the way to go. And with the 2 Aidens and then the 2 fire streaks on board, you're not talking about a crazy armament, so you could probably get away with it with this aircraft. So it would just be incredibly fast, it would be hard to kill, but it wouldn't have that great killing power that a lot of machines like the F6 actually had. And I think it's time, I think it's finally time that, you know, Britain got something at top tier which was seen as meta. I know a lot of people see the Hunter F6 as meta, but it's not meta out of the box. Instead, what it is you have to get it fully upgraded, you have to really work at it to get it, you know, meta. And even then, there are many vehicles which outdo it. Why not put in something like the Lightning so we have an actual fighting chance at the crown? The next vehicle is another British fighter, and this is the Supermarine Scimitar. The Scimitar is not a very well-known machine. You know, they didn't make a ton of them. They generally made around about 80 of them, including prototypes, and it was more of like a learning aircraft. So even though it was used in active service, it wasn't used in active service too long, and there were many different things that the Scimitar kind of struggled with, and one of the main ones was the fact that the fact it was supposed to be a naval carrier aircraft, but because it was quite a large aircraft, there were a ton of onboard accidents with these vehicles, and over 50% of the aircraft were lost in its short period of service because of these onboard accidents. So this was a vehicle which was designed for carriers, which didn't really fit on carriers. It was too chunky. So instead, as luckily in the game, you know, it won't have to take off from many carriers, especially if the carriers are incredibly small like they are compared to the ones in actual life. But I did a video on the user mission for a Scimitar, which is what you're seeing now. Very fun machine. I really enjoyed using it. So yeah, if you want to give it a go, make sure to check that out on War Thunder Live. It has access to 4 30mm cannons, on top of being able to carry 4,000 pounds worth of bombs or 4 bullpup missiles. It could also carry sidewinders, air-to-air, and as you can see, one of the nice things about the Scimitar is the fact that it had a really nice multi-role capability. Now this kind of screws Britain in War Thunder, where you have a bunch of machines which are designed as like strike fighters and then attackers, or sea, you know, attackers and then fighters. So they don't really have a defined role, and therefore they kind of get annihilated by things which do have a defined role. But that doesn't mean that in real life they didn't, you know, they weren't able to be multi-role useful, which of course is incredibly important when it comes to a lot of other machines. So yeah, it would be really nice to see the Scimitar in the game, and it will be another one of these subsonic aircraft. It never reached Mach 1, but it was incredibly close. You know, you're talking about 737 miles an hour, and if they really wanted to throw the cat among the pigeons, they could always just put a pre-production version in, which wouldn't be as good as the production version. I don't know why you would do that though. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, John Ryman, Joseph Anders, Martinez, Mopar 1969, Moxie, Super Cacti, Uyans Terry, and Elove Goats, and of course Seductive Trash Can for supporting the channel.